the threat of nuclear war. You've been in charge of an arsenal. Is that in Montana, right?
Correct. Yeah.
When you see something like this unfold and all the major players, it seems like all the ingredients are there, and it just all that it requires is one spark or like one wrong move. And even it's fascinating, the concept that, like, I listened to Dan. Do you know Dan Carlin? He's like he's not a historian technically, but he has a really cool podcast. And he kind of goes in depth, like it's like these 6-hour series on like certain points of history. And I'm like kind of like a history nerd-esque. and I got into the big, the nuclear rabbit hole after I saw Oppenheimer, as I'm sure a lot of people did. And he had this crazy 6-part series about it, kind of like Manhattan Project on through like Cuban Missile Crisis. And he mentioned after Stalin, there was a moment, and like, I suppose the closest we've been to nuclear war outside of like Hiroshima and Nagasaki was the president at the time in Russia. They incorrectly saw on the radar. Do you know about this?
I heard it. Yep.
Yeah, and then he was about to strike back, but he said let's let cooler minds prevail. Let's wait, and then ended up being incorrect, obviously. But like, I wonder how many close instances there have been of that. That's just one reported one, and Israel having nuclear weapons, Iran, China, Russia, even North Korea, like wanting to help Hamas and Palestine. Like, how close are we, do you think, to something? And is this the closest we've been since the Cuban Missile Crisis?
So this is where it's important to remember that all the conflict is being sponsored. All the conflict is being sponsored
Thus far.
And it going forward.
So you're saying it's going to stay proxy, but even if it is proxy, everyone knows it's Iran.
Correct. But that doesn't mean Iran has publicly accepted responsibility for it.
Do they have to?
To make it a state, to make it an official state action, a state has to claim responsibility, just like you saw Russia do with their attack on Ukraine, right? And let's not also forget that Israel is also serving as a proxy right now.
To the U.S.
Bingo, right? So Israel's acting on their own volition, but they're being financially sponsored. They're being militarily sponsored by the United States, just like Ukraine is being sponsored by the United States. So there's two proxies at conflict here. Israel is a proxy for the West, and Hamas as a proxy for Iran.
Yeah.
And there's whole networks that go behind that, right? Because if you're being sponsored by Iran, who are Iran's closest military and diplomatic peers? Russia and China, right? So you can see how the network spiders.
The teams have already been formed, yeah.
And that's my biggest concern.
Right.
That's the big glaring exclamation point at this point in history. The teams are being formed. The last time teams were formed like this was World War II. Axis powers and allied powers. We're seeing the same thing happen now on an economic scale. The countries that contribute to the BRICS trading bloc, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, has gone on to include Iran, has gone on to include UAE, has gone on to include, then try to include Saudi Arabia. Like, that is a team. And then you've got your UK, US, Canada, Australia, New Zealand,
Europe,
France, Germany, and even on the Western side, there's dysfunction because France doesn't really know if it wants to stay allies with the United States. Germany has already declared that they no longer want the United States to be part of NATO. They want to have their own strong military so that they can stop making decisions as NATO based on what the United States tells them to do. Yeah. So there's fracturing happening in Europe with their relationship with the United States. Now, the reason I say all that is because if you understand the sponsorship of the conflict, then you start to understand the value of the conflict. The value of this conflict, just like the value of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, is that it continues. If it stops, if there's a winner declared, then the sponsors lose their tool. Right now, they have a diplomatic tool. As long as Russia's continuing to fight Ukraine and Ukraine's continuing to fight Russia, as long as Hamas is fighting Israel and Israel's fighting Hamas, as long as these two things are happening, the sponsors have diplomatic power over each other, right? China has a reason to be in the newspaper every day, protecting Palestinians, trying to negotiate peace in Ukraine, blah, 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 blah. The same thing happens to the United States. The United States has a reason to be vocal every day without ever being seen as the aggressor, right? Essentially, China and the United States get to be innocent, mature big brothers trying to find a resolution while these petty arguments turn into unnecessary lives lost. That's the game. That's the real game here. Wealthy countries get poor countries to carry out their conflicts. What does war look like in a country itself? It's senior officers who make the most getting junior enlisted people who make the least to fight and die in conflict, right? It's just a macro reflection of what we see on a micro level. What is professional sports? It's young, healthy people making less money than the owners of the teams who are old, wealthy people.
Yeah.
It's just, that's what happens. Seniority and wealth dictates the terms for the young and the hungry.
Like I understand the concept of the proxies, but the information's like everyone knows that, like all the countries in the Middle East, they know that the US is sponsoring it, and like Iran and Hezbollah, or no, I believe, the Houthis have been bombing like US military because they know they're sponsoring them. So it's like, who are you really fooling? And at what point if the US gets involved directly, I mean, they already kind of are. I mean, I guess the broader question is, like, what's the potential for a broader conflict in like World War III, quote unquote?
So I would argue that World War III has already started, that World War III is a proxy war. It's an economic war that drives proxy conflict. World War II was old school tanks and planes and fire, bombing campaigns and nuclear threats and shutting, that was World War II. World War I was chemical warfare and digging trenches and people dying in the cold, right? The Vietnam War looked different. The Korean War looked different. War evolves from season to season. The current evolution of war is what we have seen in Syria, what we have seen in Yemen, what we have seen in Afghanistan, what we have seen in Iraq, right? It's this proxy conflict, and it's ugly, but it's happening, and it's a world that is contributing to the conflict. So people are afraid that World War III is going to involve nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
Nuclear weapons were a World War II objective.
Well, but one country had it at the time.
Multiple countries were trying to develop it.
Right.
And then what happened is, after the United States used them in Japan, they used them in a traditional tactical manner, right? Where they dropped massive bombs on the epicenters of military industrial capability and shut Japan down. But they also killed hundreds of thousands of innocent lives. And they made a giant impact crater on history to show like war crimes, to show human rights violations, to show that the United States, who is a democracy that promotes, freedom, equality, human rights, and legality, is willing to break their own rules to win in a conflict. Now that there's been a spread of nuclear weapons, what that means is it creates something called parity, which is the most useful thing about nuclear weapons. It means that now Russia gets a chance to continue its campaign in Ukraine because it has parity with the United States. So the United States can't swoop in and support Ukraine without risking the escalation on the part of Russia.
Mutually assured destruction.
Mutually assured destruction, or there's a term, I'm losing it right now. There's an analytical term. We call it a paradox.
Yeah, the paradox that there's more of it, so it makes it less likely that countries would be willing to use.
Correct. The security paradox.
There you go.
Right? More people have security, which makes it less likely that people are going to escalate using the maximum means of their security. However, the flip side to that is that the more security one country gains, it actually encourages and inspires its opponent to meet and exceed its level of security. So the United States developed nuclear weapons. Well, now all of the adversaries for the United States had to also develop nuclear weapons. So China developed nuclear weapons, and Russia developed nuclear weapons. Iran is trying to, and North Korea is trying to, right? The idea that Israel has nuclear weapons, this is one of those areas where publicly,
they're not supposed to, right?
That is an unanswered question. There are classified channels that know the answer to that question. But just to your point, when you say everybody knows, that's not really true. It means that there is a narrative out there. There's information available to people that make them believe something is true, but there is no smoking gun. There is no solid proof that Israel has nuclear weapons. To my knowledge, the possession of Israel having nuclear weapons at all is a tightly guarded classified secret. I don't know if they have it. If I did know if they have it, I wouldn't confirm it or deny it. But I know that it has not been publicly confirmed that they have nuclear weapons.
I believe I read there was an official, and perhaps it's metaphor, perhaps he slipped out of his mouth, but he was talking about the rhetoric of let's just nuke them. And so that, I mean, I don't know what that means necessarily, but like my concern, when we're talking about the parity and the mutually insured destruction and all that, my concern is that a state like Israel, I mean, I suppose it could be anybody. If you're the prime minister and you see that you're going down, what are the odds that you're just, hey, everyone's going down with me? That's my big concern.
Yeah.
If I'm already going down, it's like, hey, you guys are going to feel my wrath too.
So let's put you in those real shoes. If you were actually a prime minister and you were actually guilty of corruption and you were actually guilty of fraud, like Netanyahu is being accused of, would you actually let your entire country, would you let all of your countrymen die, including your family, including your children, your grandchildren? Would you actually sacrifice them all to protect yourself?
I obviously would not, but
you obviously would not. Why do we feel like we can assume that that is exactly what someone else would do?
Because he's done things that I would never fathom of doing.
But the thing is, human beings are all coded the same way. We are coded for survival. We are coded for not only our survival, but the survival of our progeny. That's really what drives human beings. It's not about us. It's about the generations that follow us. So it's impossible to look at somebody and say, well, you were a bad guy, so you would kill everybody in your family gladly to protect yourself. That is a conspiracy, right? That's a missing kernel of information.
But does that apply when we all have clear heads and thinking, when there's no conflict? Or we were talking about fog of war before, when you're making irrational decisions? Because I agree with you. It's not a rational decision to do so by any stretch. But people are making irrational decisions during war. I mean, it's like, even if you apply to football, which is totally different, but still, like, you see dudes making uncharacteristic decisions and mistakes all the time.
But those are happening on an individual level. The team itself is comprised of multiple individuals. And there's a hierarchy that makes it so that cooler heads can prevail, which is why you can get pissed off as, someone on the offensive line, but the coach ultimately controls the offensive line. And then there's protocols that have even higher levels of authority over individual players. The same thing happens in military conflict. So Netanyahu might want to, nuke them all, who knows what, but he still has a governing body that has to agree. He still has generals that have to agree. He still has a legislative organization above him that has to support that and pay the funds for that, right? Not to mention the fact that he's got allies like the United States that if he does something that's too overboard, he runs the risk of cutting off his primary source of support.